Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, the Tapestry of Our Seasons, December webinar series. And for tonight, we have Special Education 101, what everyone should know. We are so glad that you're here with us tonight. Throughout the event, we encourage you to share your thoughts or questions in the chat box. We'll be addressing as many as possible during our Q&A session. Before we dive into tonight's conversation, it is my honor to introduce our esteemed speakers. First, we have Dr. Samuel Kim, an associate professor at Texas Women's University and a licensed psychologist with extensive experience working in both school and university clinic settings. Next, Daniel Park is a dedicated doctoral candidate in school psychology with a focus on behavioral psychology and neurodevelopmental disorders. His passion for supporting the mental, spiritual, and physical well-being of young people truly shines through his work. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to both Dr. Sam and Daniel as they share their insights with us tonight. Thank you.
Well, it's so lovely to have all of you join us today. And for those of you who are joining us via the recording, welcome to you as well. I hope all of you are staying warm out there. Today's talk is about special education, and it's something that kind of came to mind as I was helping with my cousin's family about 6 years ago. So, about 6 years ago, my cousin's family decided to immigrate to the US. And so, when they came to the US, one of my nephews, or my cousin's son, was still a high school student. Now, he had gone to school in Korea. He was doing fine. He wasn't having any issues in school or any of his academics. But we wanted to make sure that he had all of the resources he needed in order to succeed in a school here in the US. When we went to the school, I wanted to set up a meeting to see, like, what sort of services are available, what sort of accommodations that we can have for him. And the other little caveat there, so just not being able to speak English, that doesn't mean that you go into special education. But he also had partial deafness, so he couldn't hear out of one of his ears. And so, because of that, I wanted to make sure that he was getting services for his deafness as well as for his speaking. Now, I remember sitting in that meeting, there was a general education teacher, there was a special education teacher there, and there was an administrator. And we were talking back and forth, and I was born here in the US. So my Korean is not that great. So during this translation process, my cousin's wife was there, and most of it's going fine. She was understanding the process, and then I said the words "특수교육" or special education directly translated into Korean, and immediately I saw her get uncomfortable. She started fidgeting in the chair. She started like tapping on me. It was to the point where the teachers in the room were starting to ask me, "Is everything okay?" And then I realized what I had done. By just saying "Tuksugyoyuk," I had brought up these ideas of what special education is from another country. My cousin's wife's only idea of what special education is what she's seen in Korea, which is very different from the educational system here in the US. And she was afraid that this was going to disadvantage him for his future, um, and that he wouldn't be able to attend the same school as the other children there. And so I had to take a moment to explain to her, it's like, that's not what this is. It's a little different from that. And kind of what I went through with her and debrief with her afterwards is kind of what I want to share with all of you today so that all of you are better equipped if you have a child or you know someone who has a child who's going to go through special education services in the schools. So we divided our talk into three parts. We have what is special education? Two, how does this thing called special education work? And then lastly, who are the people who are involved with it? So let's start off with the first one. What is special education? And unfortunately, to explain special education, I have to talk about a little bit of history. So the United States, before 1954, this landmark court case, there were segregated schools. There were schools for white students and there were schools for black students. And the law of the land at the time was such that as long as they are equal, you can keep them segregated. So separate but equal might be a term that you've heard. Well, there was a man named Oliver Brown who saw the white schools having better resources, had better teachers, and so he wanted his daughter to have the same opportunity to all these resources that the white children were able to access. Well, he attempted to register her at that elementary school, and the school said no. Well, that eventually turned into a big court case. And through that court case, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And during that court case, the argument was you have separate, but it's not equal. And what happened as part of that argument of this, it's separate, but it's not equal, it also invoked the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, saying that you cannot discriminate someone or reduce the privileges that someone has as being a citizen of this country. And so essentially, education is something that's provided by this country. And so if you say that a citizen of this country cannot access that, then you are essentially reducing their rights. And so that was a big part of this. Well, that codified or that made it across the land. So when a federal law becomes a federal law, it doesn't immediately go into effect. It goes to the Department of Education, who puts out policy. Those policies then go out to the different states, and the states have to decide on legislation to determine how they're going to follow that law within their states. And through that, it was codified that, okay, all children have the right to access education because the state cannot discriminate against any citizen of this country to access education because that's a part of the services that the state provides. Well, with that in place, then becomes the questions like, we have kids with disabilities. How do we educate them? And what do we do for them? Because education is a right for all children, regardless of their backgrounds and their abilities. And so we have in 1975 the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It was then reauthorized in 1990 and then reauthorized again in 2004. And some of the biggest changes that happened there were actually for parents. It was to give parents more say and more power in some of the educational decisions that are being made for these students. Also, at the same time, with all of these laws that are coming about, there's Section 504 of this big act called the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And what this does is it protects individuals, even kids, from being discriminated because of their disability, meaning all kids had to not just be able to access education, they had to have equal access to education. So IDEA and Section 504 are kind of be two big things that you might hear if you're kind of navigate the special education system within a school in the US. So IDEA is kind of and I'm sorry, I do refer to it as IDEA, although it is IDEIA is the newest authorization. But there's so many different parts of this or provisions that the law provides. I've only listed a few here, but there are so many more. Some of the ones that I haven't listed include the parent and teacher participation, where parents and teachers have an important role in determining what sort of services kids get and how they get them. Um, Schools are also focused on trying to figure out the best supports for students before they fail, because it's so much harder to help a student who has fallen behind than it is to help a student who is starting to fall behind and you start putting some interventions in early on. So let's talk about the first provision. Uh, Free appropriate public education, also known as FAPE. And this means that all students, including those with disabilities, must be provided with a free and appropriate public education. What does appropriate mean? Well, one of the big ideas here was not so much let's put all the kids with disabilities in a separate place and completely away from all the other kids. The idea was, how much can we keep these students in the classroom and part of the general education? If they just need a little help, can we just give them a little bit so that they can benefit from being in the classroom? And there's been several research studies that have come out because of this, showing benefits for students with disabilities to be educated with their general education peers. So it helps those with disabilities, and believe it or not, it's actually helpful for students who don't have disabilities to have these students in the classroom too, so have a diversity of students within there. So LRE is like the least restrictive environment. How much can we keep the student in the regular classroom? Is it just having someone come in for a few minutes to help with them versus taking them out completely from that classroom setting? One big aspect of IDEA is the IEP, or the Individualized Education Program. This is the program. So if you have a student with disabilities, how can we design a plan or a program that is individualized to them? Because the general education by itself doesn't work for them. They need something more. So this is a specialized plan that shows you, hey, this is what we have to do for this particular student in order so that they can better succeed within the classroom. Well, how do you determine, if they qualify for these things? Well, an evaluation is required through IDEA, and folks like school psychologists are within the school systems that provide these evaluation services to determine what's going on with this kid, what sort of disabilities do they have, and it's everything. In a slide, we're going to talk about what are the different criteria. But school psychologists, they're in the schools. They're different from school counselors. They do a very different job. School psychologists tend to work for school districts, and they're specifically trained to do these psychological assessments on students. Lastly, it doesn't mean that they're forever in the school under the special education umbrella and that there's no hope for them for the future. As a matter of fact, part of IDEA, meaning this is part of the law, there are transition services to determine what is this child's life or this student's life going to look like once they graduate from high school, once they exit the K through 12 educational system. What's it going to look like if they try to enter the workforce? What's it going to look like when they go into college? Are they going to need some of these services, and how are they going to access these services? So as you can see, there are a lot of protections that are set up for parents and students within IDA. As a matter of fact, there's also procedural safeguards. And what that means is anywhere throughout this process, if there seems to be questions or a parent doesn't agree with the decisions that a school is making, the parent has rights. They are able to halt the process. They are able to voice their concerns, and they can pretty much determine whether or not a child gets certain services or not. I mean, it's still done as part of the whole team that we'll talk about in a little bit, but the parents do have quite a few rights within it. And that's something that I really want to emphasize, that parents and families have a lot of rights in this. And because of that, because of the rights, and because of the decision-making power that a parent has over their student, I think one of the most important things to talk about in terms of special education is that the parent and the family have to be informed. You have to understand what is going on through the whole process. And I'll probably say it again a dozen more times throughout tonight's talk, but please ask questions. Always, always ask questions. If there's something you don't understand or something that doesn't make sense, please stop and ask questions to anyone that's part of the IEP or special education process, as well as you're welcome to ask us questions in the chat too.
Uh, and so I'm going to be talking about the eligibility criteria that we have for special education in the school system. And the law and states show us that there are 13, I believe. Yes, if I add that up, right, that's 13 there. And There's an extensive list here, and I'm kind of going to go through the ones that are typically more common, that ones that we see. But something I do want to mention, as you've kind of been noticing and seeing what Dr. Sam has been highlighting as well, is that a child's disability or their needs have to have an educational impact that requires that specialized instruction. So while I do also want to mention that while a child may have one of these listed, uh, you know, might fit into one of these categories. If they're excelling and doing really well in school, they may not need an IEP, but that is something that they would probably continue to school and would kind of continue to kind of keep track of, just to make sure if we have any missing gaps or if suddenly that child does start to need services. But again, a child's disability doesn't necessarily mean that they would require having individualized education plan or a 504 plan. But again, it has to be that educational impact is that what we're looking for. And again, parents kind of give that consent, before the school even begins that evaluation process to begin with anyway. So again, that's going to be a big thing that we're going to kind of continue to reemphasize. So your parents have and do hold a lot of power. And I think hopefully through this webinar as well, that you feel empowered about the choices that you're able to make, and hopefully are able to make more informed ones after hearing today's presentation as well. And kind of diving in, one of the most common ones that we also see is autism, and it's a neurodevelopmental disability that can affect a child's social and communicational skills, not only with their peers but even with their teachers. So we could see how that definitely could impact their ability to basically learn, whether it's being overstimulated by a very large class size, and just maybe needing more individualized sort of attention and approach. These are some things that could be strategies that do help a child with autism. Another one that we do see is emotional disturbance. In some other states, they have changed that description to emotional disability. And typically this would cover, a child who might be, struggling with anxiety, having some sort of bipolar or oppositional defiant disorder. And so that's kind of those common sort of, mental health needs that a child may have that might fall underneath that category. So, inability to regulate their emotions, and being able to follow directions, things to that nature that could definitely impact a child's ability to learn. Now, another common one that we see as well is intellectual disability. Now, students whose intellectual functioning might impact their educational performance. I think a lot of people may often kind of have this misunderstanding that just because a child may have a slightly under average, intellectual, IQ score, doesn't necessarily mean that they are qualified or need individual education plan as well, or added supports. Kids who underperform average are still able to live successful lives and able to find other ways, whether it's their interests or continue to learn in a way that is able to help them succeed. Another common one is other health impairment. Now that sounds very vague, and I think they kind of left that on purpose, just so that if that does somehow fit for some learners, that this would be a way for them to still be able to get special education services. A common one that you might know that falls under this category is something known as ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this might, in this specific example, a child may have difficulty either remaining focused or remaining still, so that allows them to be able to perform and stay up to pace with their peers. So they could have either or of those things, and typically ADHD may follow under OHI, known as other health impairment. This is probably the most common one that we also see in schools. Is called specific learning disability. And so basically what happens for children who may fall under this category, they may present with having learning challenges and difficulties that may include difficulties in processing and understanding specific things like reading, writing, and math. All of these things are core subjects in the school, right? And so some common ones that might fall under this category are things called dyslexia, right? Maybe dyscalculia, dysgraphia. I'm not sure if maybe dyslexia is one that many people have heard in the past, where dyslexia affects the brain's ability to process written language. They may have difficulties in reading well. And so that is a common one. Reading is an essential skill in order to learn in order to understand. If you think about it, at some point, even math becomes numbers, goes from numbers to letters, and that's where I also struggled, right? But that also happens where you have to read problems in order to answer them. Dyscalculia, it also is similar to math in that it actually affects a learner's ability to process numbers and math concepts, which is also something that's very crucial and needed in order to progress through school. Dysgraphia is a little bit different, where it affects an individual's ability to write and or express those thoughts into written language. And so these are some common ones that we often see in specific learning disability. Another one, maybe these last two are probably the most common that we see actually, is speech or language impairment. So oftentimes kids, who may fit under this category, have difficulties in expressing and understanding language. So a child may have a stutter or other language disorder that, affects and really challenges their ability to be able to express, their thoughts and their language. It's not that they don't have thoughts or they're not able to do that or have really coherent thoughts. It's just that their speech is what's stopping them and makes it very difficult. And so that is something that we also want to help people to understand is that just because a language or a stutter is there doesn't necessarily mean that child is not able to communicate. It's just that medium and that pathway being able to communicate is what's being really challenged and difficult. And sometimes ESL students may also fall under this category, but speech language pathologists may also think a little bit deeper and dig a little bit deeper as to whether or not this child does actually have a language impairment, or is it more they just don't have enough skills or the time to be able to just communicate in the language that they're expected to learn. And so, second language learners, you grew up in another country, came to the States. Now, this is very difficult, and which is why we also leave it up to speech language pathologist professionals who can kind of, grapple between these things. But that is another common one that students may fall under to have speech or language impairment as well.
Yeah, and I also want to emphasize from this list something that is often confused because there's a lot of words that Daniel here talked about, like autism, intellectual disability, specific learning disability. It's like, oh yeah, I've heard of these words. I've heard of ADHD. These are all psychological diagnoses. And you might have a child go get an evaluation done from a psychologist or someone at a private practice somewhere else or a hospital. And you brings like, oh, my child has a diagnosis of autism, so he or she needs autism special education services. Unfortunately, that is not how the law works. So there are these diagnosis criterion that's done through something called the DSM that psychologists and mental health professionals everywhere use in order to determine diagnoses for their clients. In special education, they do not touch the DSM at all. What they do look at is the law. So the lawmakers have written up special criteria. So each of these 13 areas has their own set of criteria that have been designed by the lawmakers since the 70s and added and changed and edited over time. And so in order for schools to go along with the law, they have to find eligibility according to these criteria. So what I want to emphasize is it's possible that you could have a diagnosis outside, but you might not get eligibility for special education within. Another super confusing thing, a child may qualify for special education services in one state, move to another state and no longer qualify because that state might define things slightly differently or they might do evaluations in a slightly different way, but still falls under the umbrella of the federal law. So these are some of the little caveats and difficulties that sometimes is difficult to navigate. So how does special education work? So it's like we've gone through all of these different eligibility criteria. I've given you a brief history lesson. Now the question is like, well, what are the steps to this thing? Um, I want to first say before we start going through these amazing snowflakes on the slide is that there aren't real steps. This is kind of steps that I've put through based on Daniel's and my experiences of being in the schools, like generally it tends to follow this pattern. So, number one, somebody somewhere notices the problem, and that somebody could be the teacher. It could be an administrator who just happens to be in touch with the student. It could be the parent who notices that there are difficulties. And in that instance, I always encourage parents to reach out to their teachers, the students' teachers. And then if they're kind of running into some roadblocks with that or it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, uh, I'll get to that in step three, but a teacher may try some classroom strategies. They might try some extra homework assignments. They might try presenting worksheets in a different way. They might try rearranging the classroom, having the students sit with a different group. Just within classroom things that the teacher can try to see if these things will help the student. If that doesn't work, then the teacher will often reach out to the administrator, typically an assistant principal or a principal, and say, I think this kid needs an evaluation to determine if he or she qualifies for special education. Now that's step three. Now, remember I said earlier that parents might notice something. And I said, well, if it doesn't feel like the parent talking with the teacher, it's going anywhere or much is happening, uh, the parents can actually submit in writing to the school a request for an evaluation, and the schools must honor that request. And so it is a way to make sure that step three happens. The evaluation is done by school psychologists, and by law, I think in most states, evaluations need to be completed within, is it 90 days? So it's about 3 months, which seems like a long time, but it's actually not very long when you consider that students are in school 5 days a week, and then there's always planning days, holidays, and all these other things where the student's not in. And so by law, these evaluations must be done there. I do want to throw in one little caveat about this part, little asterisk and side note, just for y'all to know in the back of your head. There is a major shortage of school psychologists in this country. And when I mean shortage, I mean there are districts in this country that do not have access to a school psychologist to do these evaluations. And so with this shortage, they are getting lots and lots of requests. And so this part may take a while for it to be completed because just the sheer volume of evaluations that need to be done by school psychologists. So the evaluation is done by them. It could also bring in an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, as well as a speech language pathologist, whoever needs to come in if the referral seems to include some disabilities in their areas. All right, testing is all done. And actually, before I finish the testing, you, if you happen to be a parent, are also going to get things from the school. You're going to get these little rating forms or these little surveys that are going to ask you all sorts of questions. That'll ask about your kids. Your kids seem depressed lately? Do they seem sad? Is it hard to get them motivated to do schoolwork? Is it difficult to wake them up in the morning? And you get to answer with never, sometimes, often, almost always. And depending on how you respond to those, that information gets pulled into the evaluation because the school psychologist wants to get a full picture as possible. You may also get a phone call from the school asking you lots of questions about your family, the household, the past of the kid. And I will tell you that the information that the school psychologist is gathering for that is for this report and the evaluation to determine if there's a disability. They're not using this to kind of go around and share with everybody else. So the evaluation is done. Uh, and then you get a call for a meeting, and they say it's like, oh, we want you to come in for an IEP meeting. What this means is they now have all the information that they need. And now we're going to have a meeting to determine whether or not this child or student requires special education services. On the next slide, or the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about all the different people who could potentially be there. But almost always, you're going to have the parent, a teacher, the professionals who worked with the kid, and an administrator there at bare minimum. Those people will be there because they need to help make that decision. The decision to determine if a kid is eligible for special education is voted on by the whole group. It is not a single person who decides yes or no. It is the whole group that decides that. And that's why I say to you again, if you are a parent in this meeting, do not be afraid to ask questions. Always stop, because I have been in these meetings and I am very bad with this. We will spout acronyms all day long at each other. It's like, oh, this is an IEP. They need a BIP for blah, 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 blah. An FBA that needs to be done with this, and this. If you don't understand something, it's so important for you to stop and ask what that means and what it is. And the professionals there are supposed to respond to you because you have a say, a very big say, about what services your child gets or doesn't get. So let's say we go through that meeting. There's a clear need that the student has. The student is not benefiting from the education that's within the schools. They're not doing well. They're not really learning much, and they're falling further and further behind. Well, within that meeting, they're also talking about various interventions. Like, what are some things that we can do, like special education services? Like, can we get a special education teacher to come in to provide some additional teaching? Can we provide like different kinds of resources and materials for them? And then all of that gets voted on at the meeting and then implemented. And it's not the end there. So just because the school is implementing these interventions, it doesn't mean that it stops. Once a year, typically 1 year after you did your first IEP meeting, there will be an annual review. And in that review, they're going to look at how much progress this child or student has made in the school. How much progress are they making throughout all of this? Or are they falling behind? Or are they stagnating? Or are they doing really well? That's what this annual review is about. In addition, every 3 years, there's a reevaluation. You might hear the term triennial evaluation, and that refers to this reevaluation that's done every 3 years. So every 3 years, every child in special education gets a whole nother set of evaluations done again to make sure they still qualify for special education. So it's a big process, and there's a lot of things going on here. And again, I just want to emphasize, as the parent, you have to ask questions. If there's something you don't understand in that meeting or any process, you have to ask questions, because what you say and what you sign off on are the services that a student does or does not get.
Thank you, Dr. Sam, for that. So I'm going to be diving a little bit more into one of the parts of this process that we kind of came up with, that we commonly see as the trajectory, and that is the evaluation piece. And we want to spend some time on the evaluation piece because, um, as Dr. Sam mentioned, the school typically has about 90 days, but counting for the number of school days, and also this evaluation process can take some time for the child. Some of these assessments can be up to a few hours long. So, the school psychologist is going to be mindful that we're not having the child sit there for hours at a time. Not only is that really tiring for the child, and the child may not be able to perform to the best of their ability, but also we would hate, and I know a lot of parents are usually hesitant because they don't want their child to be pulled from their normal educational like class, right? So it's like we're thinking that they're going to lose that time or not be able to keep up with their peers because they have to do all of this testing. But I can rest assured that most and a lot of the schools are going to try their best to make sure that there's a healthy balance between making sure that we're doing these assessments and evaluations so that the child can get the services that they need to see if they qualify. And also at the same time to make sure they're being mindful of not pulling them from their normal activities, and things like that, for them to still be connected to the school, because we know that school connectedness for children is also a huge part of their success. So part of this evaluation process, it's going to come down to the first thing is consent. So you as a parent, none of this is happening unless you give the green light and are signing those papers and making sure that you're informed. So again, as Dr. Sam had highlighted really well, that if you have any questions, even before you even start, to ask those questions, because you want to make sure that you know what you're signing up for. Or it's something maybe you've just heard about it from today's webinar, and then you kind of go back, oh, like I think I remember hearing about this. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Just so that you can make that informed decision. There is a little bit of that limit of confidentiality, meaning the school psychologist or those who are evaluating a child would have to be confidentiality under these circumstances, right? If the child is going to be a self, others, if there's suspected abuse of the child or elders, or a child with disabilities, and lastly, if we're subpoenaed by the court, meaning if the court asks us to come in and testify on behalf of the child, which is a little bit more rare, but that may happen. So these are the only times where the person who's evaluating a child and asking your family the questions and background information, that is one of the times that we would have to break that. Now, after we kind of go through those consent forms and are okay with the process of going through the evaluation, one of the things, a lot of these things are typically happening around the same time, but one of the things that will happen is a record review, looking at the child's previous grades. If they have moved, seeing if we have records from, their previous state and the schools that they attended. But again, also the parent interviews, as Dr. Salmon mentioned. So they're going to be asking, sending home these forms. We encourage parents to take their time through it and make sure that they are rating them themselves without the child or without a spouse, so that they can give that full picture as to what they're seeing. Because if you kind of look at your child or ask them like, hey, do you think you're doing this? And maybe they're going to say no, or maybe they're going to say yes. We're not too sure, but we definitely want to see your perspective as a parent. And some of these questions can get lengthy. And again, if you have any questions about the questions themselves, you're definitely more than welcome to ask and raise questions about those as well. And those surveys and rating forms, as you see in the bullet points down low, are going to ask about the child's social life. How are they interacting with other children, with family members at home? What are their emotions like? Are they too high, too low? Do you feel like it's a right balance, again, for their age compared to their peers? Questions like that are going to be asked. And even maybe behaviorally, do you feel like they act appropriately for their age and with their peers and things to that nature? And so while all of these things are happening as well, the school psychologist is going to make sure that they're are making sure that they're taking observations of your child in the classroom in other relevant areas. If I'm thinking about myself, if a school psychologist came and saw me in math class, they probably would have noticed me not paying attention as much because I struggled with math. If they came to me in reading or in a different class, they might have noticed that I'm able to participate a lot more strongly because I was more engaged. Lunchtime versus gym time, all these different areas, right? So again, the school psychologist is going to try their best to see the whole picture. And also maybe there are these patterns that they can also pick up and notice as well. After those observations, or as those observations are taking place, the next thing that they're going to do, or one of the things that they're going to do, is something called an educational assessment. So this assessment can take up to a few hours long, as I mentioned before, and this is where they might break this up and try to kind of keep an eye on how the child is doing. Essentially, this evaluation is looking at a child's educational strengths and weaknesses relating to reading, math, and writing. And what they're trying to see if there are significant differences, between either these subjects, right, overall, or if the child is doing well in all areas, then we might suspect that there may not be any weaknesses. But we're trying to see in what areas can we kind of can we find patterns as to where this child may need a little bit more support, and to see if they would qualify for those additional supports provided by an individualized education plan or a 504 plan. Similarly, we're going to do something called an IQ test, right? And basically, this is going to help try to measure and see how a child is doing with their ability to problem solve, reason abstractly, check their short-term and long-term memory skills, see if they're able to pay attention to certain details, pattern matching, visual, spatial reasoning, their ability to comprehend language, sequential reasoning. And these are a lot of really big concepts, and there are a lot of things that this test covers. And so you can imagine that this also is going to take some time. And so this is something that would also be spaced out depending on how the child is doing. For some children, They might think of it as a game to see, how well they do. And while the school psychologist doesn't give any sort of feedback in that way, some kids are really into it, some kids are not. And you kind of try to see and gauge how the child is doing. But essentially, right, similar to the education assessment, again, it's going to help us to identify certain strengths and weaknesses of the child, right? It's going to be able to kind of provide us with information about, how the child may benefit from certain types of instruction or specific types of supports. And, again, those rating forms are going to be sent home to be able to kind of help us understand a little bit more about the child, whether it's the environment at home and versus in different areas. All of these results, the goal is after this, all of these results are explained and shared with you parents. So there's going to be a meeting that's set up to determine eligibility. The eligibility meeting is going to tell us whether or not the team believes that the child would be eligible to receive services. But the more important thing is, I know for some parents, they're kind of concerned about, well, where do these results go? Whom are they shared with? These results are only shared with relevant individuals, meaning the people on the team and with you and the family. And those results are only shared with those whom you want it to be shared with. So I remember when I was working at the high school level and we would have these eligibility meetings, parents and families were concerned that these results would be sent to those colleges that the kids were applying to, and that it might harm their chances of getting into a certain college or being able to go on and further their education. However, that information is not shared with them at all, unless the families would like that information to be shared with them if they do qualify for services, and the families would like for those services to somehow to be continued at that level at the secondary education level in college. There are a lot of people who may be involved also in special education. But I'm also going to highlight again, some of the more common individuals who are usually a part of the team. I have listed here parents and guardians first, because you guys do hold a lot of power, more power than you think. You may think that some of these other people are the so-called experts, but you are also an expert because you're a parent of your child and you know your child really well. Probably even better than some of these other people listed here. But again, that consent is a really powerful tool to be able to either receive those services, and that's totally up to you as a family. If you feel that you're curious as to whether or not your child may need those services, and you don't agree with the services that they're suggesting, and you feel that your child needs more intensive services, that can be vocalized. If you feel like your child doesn't need as much intensive services and would like your child to just make sure that they have some level of support, but not that intensely, that is also welcome, and something that we would encourage parents to kind of be able to vocalize and share what it is that they would like for their child. And so you can kind of imagine that there's a lot of conversation that could happen between yourself and some of these other people that I might share. Typically, an administrator or a principal or equivalent to that nature would be someone that's also a part of the team. And some other times, even depending on the child's age, especially as Dr. Sam mentioned earlier, if that child is maybe around the age of 14, getting older in those teenage years, they may be able to come and join the meeting as to, that transition meeting that we talked about. What is going to happen, post high school once they graduate? Trying to think about what are some interests that they might be interested, if that is appropriate. A school psychologist is one that is also going to be on the team as well. And again, they're going to be helping to kind of run those psychological assessments and interventions, and also the ones who are going to be explaining the results, of those assessments as well. Special education teachers, as well as general education teachers, they're also going to be a part of the team as well. Someone who's most likely going to be a teacher already and of that student and of your child as well. And one big thing that we would like to mention is that interpreter services are also available as well. And so, if English is not your first language, then that is something that you could request for, and so that there is someone in the room who is able to kind of help you to obviously understand what is going on and to kind of advocate on your behalf. At the same time, depending on the language that you speak, especially if it's maybe a little bit more rare, there might not be someone who's able to provide that as well, which can also get very difficult. But the school is going to make their best effort to make sure um, that that interpreter is able to be found in some way or form, whether it's like via call or telehealth, things like that. If they're able to provide that, they will try their best to do so. Unfortunately, it may not be um, as perfect situation as we'd like, or we may not be able to get that language again, depending on the availability as well.
All right. Well, believe it or not, we've come to the end of the talk already. We've talked about what special education is. We've talked about what the process looks like, and we've talked about the different people who are involved with it. So, at this time, over the next 6 minutes, if you have questions that you would like to ask us, please feel free to put it into the chat. And while y'all are marinating on that question that you want to ask us, we actually came up with a list of some frequently asked questions or questions that we typically run into. So I'll start with the first one. Will going through special education make it hard for my child to go to a good college? Not necessarily. Um, just going through special education itself does not disqualify anybody from going into a good college or not. Daniel had mentioned before, this is information that's kept confidential within the schools and shared only if you want to share it. And you may want to share it when you get to a university because there is an Office of Disability Services and there are some services that can be afforded to you if you do have a particular disability. So, no, it will not make it any harder. Daniel, want to take the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. Will this help my child get additional time on standardized tests? Um, it will really come down to their educational impact. If we do find that um, the IEP warrants for that additional testing time, that is something that is helpful. Maybe for a child with anxiety, need a little bit more time, or they have difficulties in processing, reading things like that, or may need another way of understanding that material. That is something that would be added. But if the child does not, um, that would not warrant for an additional time for those standardized tests.
Mm. Yeah. And different kinds of services come in for different things. And so if particular accommodations need to be made, then that's all within the IAP plan. And different organizations like for SATs, for example, is done by Pearson. And so Pearson may have specific requirements of what proof they need in order for a child or a student to get those services, and each of those will have their own requirements. All right, the next question that I often get is, hey, how much does it cost to get this psychological evaluation to be done for my kid? And I have waffled on this answer, and it's everything between free and you've already paid for it. I say free because there's no immediate cost to it. The school's not going to throw you a charge for this evaluation that's being done. It's something that must be given to all students in a public education system. As a matter of fact, if your child is in a private school, there are states that have regulations around requiring the school psychologist for the public school system to come in and to do an evaluation for that child within the public or private school setting as well. So the laws are very clear about getting access to education for all kids. Now, what do I mean by you've already paid for it? Well, a lot of this comes from education, public education, as well as the taxes that have already been paid for it. So if many of you are paying taxes, you've already paid for a lot of these services through the taxes and funding the education in your local area. So there should be no additional cost that is included for any of these evaluations to be done within the school. All right, Daniel, can a parent go get this evaluation done outside of the school, like at a hospital, a private practice, or somewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we should clarify maybe what that evaluation is for. So, as Dr. Sam mentioned earlier, the school cannot diagnose a child like we would with the DSM. And so, if there's a suspected, diagnosis for autism or for any other sort of mental health need, that is where you would have to get a private evaluation done, whether through, a hospital, or, maybe a psychologist or anyone who is able to kind of provide that sort of diagnosis, or that evaluation. However, we're talking about the individual education plan. Um, this can get kind of tricky in my understanding, and Dr. Sam, please correct me if I'm wrong about this as well. But most schools will want to have that evaluation done within their school. However, if there is one that's been recently completed, like I think the sooner, closer to the test, the time that they are evaluating the child, the more that they would probably honor that evaluation or take parts of that evaluation, whether it's done privately, or through, another, either institution or hospital that's able to provide that evaluation. They may take parts of it, like the record review would be where they would check to see if there were any evaluations completed. Um,
Evaluation more so for, oh, can you guys still hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I think my headphones died here. But yeah, that would be another way that we would look at that evaluation process.
All right. Well, I do have one question in the chat. And it's a good question because it thinks about like the political climate that's going to occur in the next year, as one of the things that's been floated around with the next president is potentially dismantling or changing the Department of Education. So if there were some big changes that happened to the US Department of Education, how would that affect some of these services that are here? The short answer is I'm not sure. Because yes, the Department of Education oversees a lot of these things, but this is also laws. So there are federal laws like IDA, as I was talking to you about earlier, as well as state laws that regulate how special education is administered within the schools. And so because of that, I'm not exactly sure because these laws don't just simply go away if the Department of Education is changed or it happens to disappear. So it's going to look different, but I don't believe it's going to immediately disappear. And that's the best answer I can give for that without being able to tell the future. All right. Are there any other last minute burning questions out there? Well, it has been a pleasure talking with all of you. Thank you so much for having us. And I will turn this back over to Jiwon.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to our incredible, wonderful speakers, Dr. Sam and Daniel, for your invaluable insights and wisdom shared today. And now I would like to introduce several resources for you to explore. On our website, we have an online directory for Korean American mental professionals across the nation. You can select the state and browse Korean American mental professionals there. Also, we have reports and bilingual blog posts, whether you're seeking personal journeys, tips on finding the right therapist, or maybe we can possibly add more about special education as well. Our blogs offer a wealth of resources. And we have also an incredible podcast hosted by Dr. Sam here and Sharon Kim. The podcast caters to professionals and lay people, even to those who are simply curious about research. And next, I want to highlight what's happening this Wednesday. We'll be joined by Roy Kim, a former pastor turned licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex addiction therapist. In this session, titled Supporting Loved Ones in Rocky Marriages, Navigating Challenges During the Holiday Season, Roy will share practical insights on offering empathy, understanding, and guidance to loved ones facing marital struggles, especially during the holidays. We believe this is a very timely and impactful topic, so we hope to see you there as well. And last but not least, we would like to talk about giving.
Your generosity can make a real difference. Like today, by donating to our cause, you will help us continue providing vital resources and support to Korean American individuals. Every contribution, no matter the size, helps us break down barriers and ensure that mental wellness is within reach for all. Once again, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to everyone who joined us this Monday evening. We hope the rest of your week is as encouraging and inspiring as our time together. Thank you once again, everyone. Thank you. Good night.